So I want to talk about not only a couple of your recent fellowships, but some of your creative works and how you do that in the academy. So you were awarded the annual Equity for Women and Girls of Color Fellow from Harvard University. Let's clap that up real quick. So can you tell us a little bit about what you did there during that year?
Sure. So first, I just want to thank you all for being here today and thank the wonderful folks behind CCF. I've now been coming for, I guess, 5 years. This is my fourth one. I missed it last year because I was at Harvard. And thank you for considering me creative. And what I do creative, often as academics, we don't feel necessarily inspired to be creative in the work that we do. But the creative is where I start. It's where I begin. I grew up as a dancer and in theater, so I always wanted to connect the arts to what it is that I do and how the arts can be used as a site of resistance. So the fellowship that I had was looking at a new project that I'm starting that's about state violence against Black women and girls. And part of the book was, initially, it was just gonna be this book detailing what that looks like. Everything from Black women dying at the hands of police, Black women dying in police custody, the rampant murder of trans Black women. It was just this range. And I woke up one day and I was just weighed down by the fact that I was dealing in Black women's death every day. That I was looking at these autopsies, I was looking at these obituaries, I was listening to the stories that their families would tell us about them so we knew who they were in life and not just figures that we get as hashtags or an in memoriam of. And I knew that the second part of my book had to be about resistance. It had to be about how we respond to these acts of violence. What are communities doing? What are we moving towards? And so much of that was creative resistance. So much of that was the art that was being created, the theater projects, the films, the documentaries, the chants that were coming up on the streets, the music that was being made on the spot and in studios. And I was inspired again because I knew our story wasn't just being killed, just not surviving, but also what it looks like to think about Black folks living and thriving, and in response to systems that seem ubiquitous in terms of the ways in which they impact Black women and girls. And so the creative energy that I felt at Harvard, because I had a year where I wasn't teaching, I wasn't doing service, I was post-tenure, so I finally got to breathe a little bit from the requirements of the institution. I really got to dig in to that, and I would sit and talk with folks. I got very lucky because at Harvard this particular year, there were a number of activists who were also on fellowship. So I got to engage with people who were on the ground. The artist Tef Poe was there on a fellowship, and he was, if anyone's seen Who Streets, recent documentary about the Ferguson uprising, is one of the kind of featured protesters, but is also a rapper, an artist, who came to most people's public consciousness on 106 in Park. Winning the freestyle battle like over and over and over again. And I met him and we just started doing different kinds of work. I had one of the legal observers from Ferguson who was also there on fellowship. I had a few folks who were part of the Baltimore uprising. So that energy, we would come together and we would hold what I would consider a cipher about what this looked like, what this felt like, to really get in and think about what it means to be on the front lines of both the attacks of white supremacy and patriarchy, as well as what it looks like to be on the front lines of resistance to that. And so I thought that that creative energy of doing something collaborative, right? As a feminist scholar, collaborative work means a lot to me. The institution wants you to do individual. What do you publish individually? What is your intellectual acumen? How smart are you as an individual? But I know both from a community-oriented space and both from the neighborhood I grew up in, my family, the collaborative is always better. What we can do together, how we can build together. So I always see my work in that way, and Harvard gave a great opportunity with my cohort and other fellows around campus and staff, and this is the semester that Cornell West came back to Harvard, just sitting for hours and rapping with folks. Made the work, it enlivened the work in new ways.
Thinking about your collaborative work and not wanting to be, because academia is really a solo situation. It can be, but you're being very intentional about bringing other people who may or may not be in the academy.
Yes.
What are some best practices you would say if folks want to, not only folks who are in the academy, but just in general, kind of thinking about how do I collaborate with other folks to build something greater?
Right. I think for me, I've always looked for people I just vibe with, right? People who not necessarily always agree and have similar wavelengths, but are committed to. There's the basic principles or values that I like to work with in terms of people. Are you committed to freedom? Are you committed to justice? Are you committed to the most marginalized, right? I often say the margins of the margins. And think about how do we do a project that allows us to center those communities that aren't, right? That recognize my own history and background. Like I always tell people, like I've only been Dr. Lindsey for 7 years. I'm Treva Anthony's daughter for 30 years, right? And so from Northeast DC, from a different background than what the title or the institution gives me. So I don't get my sense of self from the institution. My sense of self is from my community. I feel obligated to the community. I feel obligated to the communities that raised me. And so I love opportunities to work with, not to pull in or kind of look back and pull up. I think that's a horrible way to think about our communities. And not just to drain our communities either of the things that they produce, the knowledge that's produced in those spaces, but really look at these different knowledge sites, these different creativity sites, and say, we can do something. We can do something really amazing. For me, that's looked like articles that I've published with other scholars. It's looked like creating a journal space where we have activists, artists, poets, healers, all involved in our journal. So for me, it's about transforming certain spaces while also recognizing the limitations of these spaces. The academy is a limited space for me to do the work that I want to do, the work that I feel purposeful about. Right? That's one way of me shifting things. But I also, a black girl from DC, from public housing, was never supposed to be in the academy, let alone ever supposed to be at Harvard, right? My ancestors built it, right? The hands of my ancestors literally built these institutions, but in no way did they imagine me in their classroom, let alone as their professor, as an authority of knowledge, and as someone who's saying, if we're not committed to those folks outside of these walls, then the work that we're doing in here is just valueless, right? That if it's not impacting and it's not connecting, so I try and bring in as many folks who are these knowledge producers, or what we call in the academy organic intellectuals, to the spaces that I have access to, using my resources, as Craig Digger mentioned earlier, like what you inspire, who you bring along with you. And don't think of it as looking back and pulling up, but like this more lateral, communal kind of way of thinking about all the ways that I learn. And I consider myself a consistent learner. Right? I'm a teacher like this much of the time. I'm a learner all the time. I learn from my students, I learn from my neighborhood, I learn from my parents, I learn from my godchildren, I learn from the artists that I'm surrounded by in this community. I learned from the activists who are doing this work in terms of organizing. So it's also opening yourself up to learning from other folks. That's a collaborative process too, because you're opening yourself and practicing a critical listening model for engaging other people.
You mentioned this creativity as resistance and working with other creatives and artists in conjunction with the research and work that you do.
Yeah.
What are some things that maybe it's that you maybe call the most transformative or the best or the most impactful creativity that you saw come out of some of your collaborations?
Oh, that's a hard one. So I don't know if y'all watch Insecure or are familiar with Issa Rae, but I too rap in a mirror. Various things. I'm not a good rapper, but I have a great rapper voice. Like if I had bars, it would be dope, but I don't. So I'll holler like speak of somebody to give me some bars and then I can, make it work. But some of this is creating that energy. It actually helped me with my writing process. I got stuck at one point writing my first book, which is like a history of Black women in my hometown. And I was like, I want to enliven these women. People don't know about these women, and these women are so dope. And I just started like going in on the mirror, and I was like, let me record this. And my friends would kind of play it back, and a couple of them who are also non-rapper rappers would kind of rap back their responses to me. And then I had this like track, and I transcribed it, and part of that actually ended up in the intro of my book. right? The rhythm and the flow of it, because it was natural, it was connected, and it was collaborative, right? There was a way that I was in community. It's certainly a different form of peer review than you're used to in the academy, where you send in and some anonymous person reads you fulfilled and can hide behind their little computers and whatnot, right, in doing that. And this was like people who cared about me, but also cared about the work and could feel the passion that I had, because I wanted to make sure the passion that I had for this was conveyed in that. I don't do stuff that I'm not impassioned about. And so that means I always have to check in with folks. So I feel like one day maybe there'll be like a lost tapes of the first book, or kind of all my projects when I'm doing those in the rap, in the mirror raps. It's also inspired choreography for me. I got back in the dance studio when I was writing. I realized it had to be a part of my practice to do the work that I wanted to do, because that's my first artistic language, is dance. So I had to get back into that space in order to finish the book. So sometimes it's not just about, I guess, the end product of what the world sees, but what are the processes that you use to develop, to create, to disrupt. And for me, it was connecting to those things that had always been there for me. I've been dancing since I was 2, so when I was like, I gotta focus, I gotta finish this book, I can't go to this dance class, I can't work on this choreography, I got stuck, because I wasn't using the energy that was already within me. I wasn't allowing these women to move through me. As you see, I talk a lot with my hands. I'm a movement person. And so that movement had to be part of the process. And I tried to write an intro that mirrored that movement. And I think as a collaboratively, we all kind of figured out what is our natural language of expression as we started to write stuff. And I noticed I write like I dance. There were certain percussive beats, there were certain things that had to flow, but that rhythm, that intricacy was mirroring my own artistic energy. And in a collaborative, I was able to find that, own it, and decide this is going to be my process.
So you mentioned your first book, Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C. It is. Well, first, I have my own personal question. Where did you find that picture?
So in 2007, I was in the archives, and I was still a graduate student at this time at the DC Historical Society, and I saw this image in the archive. It was it had no description really, just 1920s Washington, D.C. And it's a black and white image. Actually, an artist colored it for me in-house at my press. And I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna use this for, because at the time, I had not yet decided on my dissertation topic. I was just in the archives. And I just kept it. And so when it came time for the cover, I was like, I got an image. I got a badass image that I want to use. Because these women, if you get up close on it, I mean, their look, their face, their pose. We often think about black cool pose in terms of black masculine performance, but I was like, this is some black woman. I called it, like, my hashtag for the book originally was the original bad and bougie. Embodied this energy that just was like, so fierce, so dynamic, so polished, so just bad. And I was like, yeah, these are the women who reinvented my hometown. These are the women who shaped Chocolate City. And the artist was like, let's color it. Your book is called Colored No More. They sent it to me, and it was beautiful. I mean, this was the first cover I got. I didn't have to go through multiple rounds or anything. And I think it conveyed so much. I know people who bought the book just because they saw the cover. Which shows to me that connection with an artist and vibing with an artist produced something that was reflective of my work.
Can you talk a little bit more about the book? So thinking about you are researching your hometown.
Yes.
And wanting to dig into the history of where you grew up. What are some things that stood out to you in your research? Maybe a particular woman or a particular movement?
Yeah.
Share with us what you wrote about and what was interesting.
Yeah, so this book is 10 years in the making in a lot of ways. I got the copy of my first book 10 years to the day that I defended my dissertation. I got it 5 years to the day of defending my dissertation, but I got it 10 years from when I defended my dissertation proposal, right? So it was like I kept on doing stuff on April 5th, not sure why, but it meant a lot to me. And I'd been in these archives, and I wanted to know who were these women who walked the streets of the city that I walked? Who were my foremothers in my hometown? And what I came to realize, not only were they my DC foremothers, but I also went to Oberlin College in Ohio, which was the first school in the United States to admit black women. So a lot of the black women who were college educated during this era also went to that school. So I was like, there are all these connections happening. I need to figure out what's going on. Who's this community of women that are like my direct parallels? Leave DC, go to Oberlin, and then go to these other institutions and do graduate work, some of them. And I found all these connections. So it was real personal at first. I really was digging for myself 100 years ago. And then I found all of these stories that I wanted to include in the book, and all of these amazing women who I maybe seen a street name or a dorm name at Howard or something, but I knew nothing about. So one of the women I write about in the book is this woman named Lucy Diggs Slow, who was actually, I knew of her more from a Greek organization context as the first president of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And then I learned she was also the first black woman to ever win a national tennis championship. I was like, word, right? A national tennis, she is the precursor to the Williams, the Sloan, the Madison, oh, well, I guess US Open's on right now, right, with a black woman in it. She's that precursor. She was also a musical director. She's the first woman dean of Howard University. She also spent her life with her lover and partner, Mary Burrill. So she was also a queer woman of color. And her partner was this equally accomplished New Negro era writer and poet and playwright. So they were like this dope power couple in there. And she like helped create the women's campus at Howard, demanded that women be able to be leaders on campus and just change the game. And she met with so much resistance from black men on her campus, right? And so it highlighted some of these tensions that I've been elucidating in kind of social movement history, how we negotiate black liberation struggles within our community and how we do this. And assuredly, her queer identity impacted how she was treated by some folks as well. And there were definitely progressive black men who rode for her really hard as well. But it was like, this seems like this could be happening in 2017, some of these battles, some of these conversations. But she was a trailblazer, and like no one knew about her. She brought one of the first known cases of sexual harassment in higher ed. Right? She does work against sexual violence. She's like a precursor to so many things, and how many people had heard of her before now? Right? And she's so important in the context of not just DC, but African American history, women's history, social movement history. So my book really tried to commit to all of these different sites of the unknown. I use beauty culture because I love beauty stuff. I love makeup, I love hair, I love all of it. I love femme performance in all of its glorious and over-the-top forms. But I also wanted to know this business that made a middle class out of black women, that made them entrepreneurs, and figuring out how they contested white beauty standards in their own beauty industry, and how in many cases they replicated beauty standards, not unlike we see today. And we see these precursors of what now is the kind of digital revolution of black natural beauty happening in a mass media way in the early 20th century among black women. So a lot of it was like, how do I get where we are today? And how do I look at the women who were my literal foremothers to see better where we are today? And so I always sat with them. And one of the parts of my writing process that was really creative, I got to write in DC for the most part. So I would go and write in the neighborhoods and the places that these women lived in, that they moved through. So I really got to be in space with them. And I believe very much so in ancestral presence, so it was very cool to feel like they were with me the whole time. And in the end, I ended up dedicating the book to Relisha Rudd, who was a black girl who went missing in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago. And the story just stuck with me. And I was like, maybe when this book comes out, we'll know more about her. We'll know more about these missing black girls, but this framework of who was missing. Right? And of course, right before my book came out was that whole thing of all these missing black girls in DC, specifically. So it felt very timely, it felt very organic the way it played out, but it also was inspired by these kind of creative ways of asking the question, who am I and who have we been?
So I know you had to have found a lot of information thinking about DC and Howard and all those different things. I'm wondering, was there a topic or a person that didn't make the cut? that you wish maybe there's like a volume 2 you could do that you would add?
The outtakes, yo, people were shady toward each other. They read each other in the 1920s, right? But in like very 1920s terms. So there were all these very like, there's a lot of shade between the president of Howard, who was the first black male president, and Lucy Diggs Slow, to the point where she literally writes in a document, he cannot come to my funeral. Right? Like, it's held at Howard, but the president of the university cannot come. Do not let him in the door, right? He doesn't come, right? I mean, he can't stand her or her partner. He's an ordained Baptist minister. He has a lot of issues with her, like, very kind of proto-feminist standpoint, the fact that she lives with a woman, like, they have battles. And she, like, writes a whole letter, and it's in the archive. I mean, there are all these exchanges between them that are unbelievable. She was, I mean, there was an allusion to his inadequacy in one of the letters, right? I mean, it's just unbelievable that they're talking about this. There's shade, there's Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper shade. Anna Julia Cooper's like, so you stole my work and whatnot, which is not wholly untrue. I recommend reading Beyond Respectability by Brittany Cooper to get a kind of longer history of all of this black intellectual production that we'll know probably more prominently associated with certain black towering intellectuals that in many cases was just literally ripped off from black women. You can find the kind of origins of a lot of these things and a lot of these tensions that surprise. One of the chapters in my book looks at a community of black women who are writers, and all of your favorites from the Harlem Renaissance would go here, workshop. These women would take it to the shed, right? And they're actual pieces that got published that were really the pieces of women in this space, whose names we don't know. And so a lot of the estates were very protective of what gets out and what doesn't get out about certain people. And particularly because this community of women, a lot of them were same gender loving black women. And so their families are very protective in certain ways of what comes out about their relationships. One of the reasons I stopped where I stopped, because 1927 is a year where I can kind of publish images and things without permission, right? The copyright on them looks different. So a lot of my images are pre-that for that reason. Because families were like, you are not printing this love letter from this woman to this woman. Right? And I mean, they wrote like long, loving, gazing letters to each other. Some were partnered with men of the Harlem Renaissance who were actually in other relationships with men. So there's a lot of stuff around sexuality in the 1910s and 20s that got left out of this, because I also didn't want my book to feel salacious. Like, let me tell y'all what was really going on, right? As opposed to, what are the things that I thought were really significant to whet people's appetite about the nation's capital? Like, this was the seat of power, and this is the first major city that becomes predominantly black. And black women have a huge role in that. I mean, their population in 50 years increases by 800% from after the Civil War until 1910. 800%. Right? So they shaped this city. And so I wanted to give these different vignettes and hopefully get people interested in learning more about DC, and more importantly, getting into archives and hearing the stories firsthand. Then you can get all the salacious and juicy details that I can't say. But all your faves are probably dramatic, right? Like really dramatic and letter dramatic, right? They put a lot of stuff in writing, which is kind of shocking. But then certain things they didn't keep. I can only find one very kind of intimate, clearly loving picture between Lucy Diggs Slow and Mary Burrell, even though they lived together for their entire lives as adults. They bought 3 houses together in DC. There was one picture of them that even acknowledged any kind of intimate, just not even romantic, just intimate dynamic. That's the only one that made it into the archive. Beyond that, although it was well known when Lucy Diggs Slow dies, and she dies early, very early, prematurely, from a stress-related disorder. And I contest that a lot of this was a stress she was dealing with, a very tense administration and people, and homophobia. By and large, that were a huge part of why she dies early. There are these beautiful letters from all of these leaders to her partner, Mary Burrell, And it's just this beautiful acknowledgement of their relationship, but it's an acknowledgement they couldn't get and couldn't publicly have until she was dead. And so that resonated with me as I was doing this work, that importance of lifting these women and giving them, reinvigorating their lives.
So wanting to close a little bit about publishing through a traditional house is a bit of a different and much slower process
Yes.
than doing your online work like with NPR, Al
Right.
Jazeera. What do you want your work to do when you're thinking about how quickly people can access those articles in Cosmopolitan, and you being one of the first people to talk about some of the challenges that was going on with the rapist in
Oklahoma City.
and no one really breaking that information. Tell us about what you want your work to do for folks who read, and how do you want them to apply that to their everyday lives?
Yeah. I write a lot about Black women, unapologetically. I write a lot about Black people. I write a lot about queer folks of color. And I want, I was like, shorthand, I want them to say her name. And I mean that not just in death, but really to understand these names, to think about who is affected by these systems that we're protesting. I want people to understand how high the stakes are. And my grandmother, before she passed in 2015, she would always joke with me. She was like, I just want to get something where I don't need a thesaurus to read your damn book, right? And I was like, I promise I got you. That next week was my first public piece for Al Jazeera, because I knew there was something like, I'm writing all this stuff, I'm connecting, I'm doing this work, but the people who help give me my voice, the people who are deeply affected by the very things that I'm talking about, who are more vulnerable to these kinds of harm and violence, don't have access to some of the spaces that I was working in, right? They weren't gonna have access to university press books. They weren't gonna get access to articles that were published on journals that are like $900 for an institution to publish. And some of this was wrapped up in the performance of academic jargon, right? Which you have to perform to prove that you deserve to be there. And I was like, I stopped doing that a while ago in my academic journal. I'm like, this is my voice. Tenure or not, that's not who I'm writing for. But it took me a minute to get there, to not care as much about that thought. And it ended up being a great thing for me. But then when I started to be able to write for these outlets, I knew my audience was different. And I knew I could just say it plain. And it's not dumbing down, it's not anything. It's like the work of making something accessible actually for me is more difficult than the kind of floral nature of academic jargon. Right? I had to make it plain. I had to make you care about Sandra Bland. I had to make you care about Maya Hall. I had to make you care about Renisha McBride. Right? I couldn't just leave a statistic there. It's one thing to say 13 Black women came forward about being raped or sexually assaulted by a police officer. Right? That's a fact, and that stings, right? But I had to make you understand what that meant. Why that was overreach, how that fit into a history, how often that happens and it goes unreported. And so writing a piece that connected with people on that level and did justice to the injustice these women endured was important. So I now consistently love to write in these public outlet spaces because I know that there's an audience that may never read this, but will read me on Cosmo, or may now come to this, right, thinking, and I'll be like, okay, don't, it's a little academic. It's not exactly like my pieces in these other places, but they will connect, and those are the stories that people email me about. Those are also the stories that result in death threats, calls to my mother. My mother and I have the same name, so they find a Treva Lindsey, and they attack. Those are the things that make me more vulnerable in the institution because I am outspoken and I unapologetically believe that it is our duty to fight, right? And so writing is one of those ways that I'm able to do that, and I want to write. So I always think that like now my grandmother is sitting somewhere with the ancestors, listening to Marvin Gaye, literally listening to him, sitting there and reading my pieces and smiling, right? That means a lot to me on an affective level. that affective level is emboldened by the fact that now I think I'm more effective at telling the stories of Black women and girls and femmes.
So you can Google Treva and find these public articles, but one of you might actually get a book.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So I have a book for someone. I'll just do first.
So you have a question for the
I
audience,
have a question
right?
for the audience. I'm a historian and a teacher, so I have to have questions for the audience. That's what I do. So the question is, anyone know, and no professors can answer this, Harriet Tubman's legal birth name?
No Googling.
Stay off your
Stay off
phones.
your phone.
So y'all all have some homework.
You can email her, and then maybe you can get the book then.
Yes. My second one might even be hard. I was going to say what was Assata Shakur's legal birth name that she...
Assata Shakur's legal birth name. Okay, y'all can Google real quick. Y'all get like 1 minute.
That's her married name. But that was good. That's close. You're closest so far. Joanne's is correct to start with, though.
All right, if y'all Google it, find it, come to your memory, because I know you all know these things, right?
Whoever...
Not Cassius Clay.
Cassius Clay? Really?
Find Treva. You're going to be hanging out with us for a little
Whoever
bit,
did
right?
this, yes, I'll be here. Whoever said Joanne Chesimard, though, who's that?
Come on up. Come on up. Congratulations. So make sure you look out for Colored No More in your favorite bookstore. You can also find Treva's work online. A lot of great work. We can take a couple questions. Oh, sure. Yes.
I love when you said you knew what your first artistic language was. Oh, thank you, Marsha. You said my first artistic language was dance, and that influenced your writing.
Yes.
And does influence your writing. What would you say to somebody who's sitting here that realizes they're not even sure what their first artistic language is yet and how to find that?
I say so much of what we do is about self-awareness and sitting with oneself and figuring out what's your first response when something happens? What does your body do? Do you say something? Do you turn on music? Do you sing out loud? Do you automatically want to draw? I think it's actually taking stock of what your visceral and immediate reaction is to something spectacular or something that really captures your attention, either negatively or positively, right? To figure out what it is that's in you to respond to that thing, right? And often I find that my first reaction is always to move, right? It's not necessarily dance itself, but I feel stuff in my body. And so my body starts moving when I hear really good news or something really terrible, right? When I see a new hashtag up on Twitter and it's marking the death of somebody, my body, literally, my first reaction is my body kind of caves in. Right? I'm learning in that moment that gesture and movement are my first response to something. Some people have to write immediately when something exciting or terrible happens. Some people have to turn on their favorite song when something happens. Some people start sketching or drawing or creating or just throwing words around and are starting a kind of poetic voice. So really take stock if you haven't found that yet. And chances are it may be there, but you might be running from it or thinking you're not good enough, right? So the first thing is recognizing you're good enough to listen to yourself, to trust yourself, and to take stock when that something happens. What is it that you do, right? What is your response to that thing? That most likely is the thing that comes most naturally to you, that is authentic to your responsive self. And I think the artistic language, the creative energies that we move are the ways in which we respond to the different stimuli of the world, right? That way of engaging it, that way that you feel, which doesn't mean it's the thing that you end up being best at, right? I think my natural gift is probably more theater than it is dance, right? But dance is the first thing I do. And then I worked on it and crafted it and became a good dancer, whatever technically that's supposed to mean. But the probably best thing I do in terms of artistic is theater. Right? Some of that has to do with voice. It's a combination of writing, reading scripts, and voice, and conveying different characters. I love conveying different expressions. Right? That's part of it too. But that natural one is so important to get in touch with, because then it gives you a brave space to operate from when something terrible happens, that you have something that you can do, that you're armed with to move through the world.
A second ago, you were talking about writing in a common voice so people can understand that's not academic. Forget tenure, forget all that stuff.
Yeah.
There's institutionalized elitism, obviously, in the academic sector. The first step, of course, is getting people from different backgrounds into academic sector, different people of color, different people from sexual backgrounds, different people economic backgrounds, whatever it may be. What strategies have you used and found most effective to, once you got into this space, to make those relationships with those other people not token, so that you're seen as a real individual of value in that sector? What things have been most effective for you to break down those barriers?
Yeah. So one, this is a partial answer to your question in that some of my work is committed to the fact that like I'm already doing labor. And so part of the breaking barrier work is actually on the folks with institutional power. It adds labor to folks of color, queer folks, women, to come in and then be like, now I'm, in addition to all of the responsibilities I have as this, you now want me to do your diversity work, right? Or your inclusion work. And you're not gonna pay me anything extra to do it, right? Because they don't actually see it as labor that happens. Like, having your institution be anti-racist is a lot of work. But I think what that means for me is finding other like-minded individuals within the institution, and that includes students, staff. Some of the best conversations I have on my campus are with my custodial staff. Like, we just sit and wrap it up about whatever is happening in the world. Those kind of conversations feed me in a certain way, and we also get to talk about our relationships to the institution, right? Our relationships are very different, as like, I'm a tenured faculty member with a certain level of job security and protection, and my custodial worker, depending on OSU's whims, which we never know, could be gone tomorrow, right? It's based on hourly. She has to think about sick days, things like that, taking care of her family in certain ways, reminding myself of that and connecting to those things, that she's also engaging with me on a level of like, I get a moment to sit here and someone take me seriously as an intellectual and as a thinker. And recognizing and bringing that knowledge of self for me, of knowing like knowledge gets produced in so many places outside of the academy. In fact, some of the most valuable knowledge I move through isn't in a book that I read in the academy. It's in these conversations that I've had with people who articulate their experience as well. And so part of what I think I can make space to do in the academy is continue to lift up those kinds of intellectual production, that kind of knowledge production, to create space for that, to make syllabi that accommodate that, to make my students understand that they're engaged learners and scholars and thinkers and movers in the world. I try and use what's called engaged pedagogy in the space of the classroom. And so that means that I see myself as a learner and unlearner in conjunction with the people who are in my classroom. And that it sometimes can be challenging as a young woman of color standing up in front of a classroom of predominantly non-people of color, who will question my authority, question if I deserve to be there, if I've earned the right to be there. And there are ways that I've learned to disarm those folks when those attacks come. But mostly, the best thing I've done is be me and be fully me in the spaces that never intended to have me there. I wasn't going to get tenure not being me. That wasn't going to sit right with me. So I wrote about violence. I did collaborative work, which was something that I was advised against because of the field that I'm in. I did a lot of the things you shouldn't do, but because they were from me, and I'm good at my shit, right? It passed whatever elitist test or whatever that is. I've been moving through historically white institutions, and I say historically white, not predominantly white, because these institutions were designed to be white. So they're not predominantly, that's not by chance, right? Historically white institutions all of my life. I've been the only one 1,000 times over. Part of moving out of the space where I felt like that put labor on me was recognizing it's your job to not be racist. It's your job not to be sexist. It's your job not to be homophobic. It's your job not to be transphobic, right? That's not my work.
We got one last question. Real quick, we're going to transition. So the schedule has another speaker at this time, but he was running a little behind on the road. So we're going to take our break now and start back up at 3 with the speakers. But the break is designed so you can go grab you some food, patronize the vendors. We wanted to build in some time so that you could really take in the vendors. There's vendors upstairs and downstairs, so please, please patronize. We're gonna ask this one last question, and then we're gonna take a break, and we're back here at 3, and we're gonna end, we got a lot more content for you, okay? So bear with us, y'all. One last question.
Hi, my name is Toby. I also was a gender studies major in undergrad, and I rarely meet other Black women who are other gender studies majors, so super cool to hear you speak, and I really agree with a lot of what you said. I was curious, did you study gender studies in undergrad, or did you study something else and then go into women's studies?
Sure. So this is a terrible thing to say, right? I've been a women's and gender studies professor. This is going on my 8th year. I have never taken a gender studies class. I was trained in undergrad. I did AFAM, econ, and sociology.
For us non-academics, what are those? What are those?
I was an African American studies, sociology major, and econ minor in undergrad. And then I did my master's and my PhD in history. So I'm a historian. I always considered myself, especially once I got to graduate school, a feminist historian. Someone who's very interested in the question of gender and gender identity and sexuality and critical race theory. So those things were always important to me in the work that I did. But I hate saying this, like, especially in public, but I told my department this. I was like, I didn't take an intro. I didn't take feminist theory. I didn't take any of that. And yet, I did read a lot of the things that ended up being part of that. And I learned my feminisms from different folks engaging, doing the work. I was an anti-rape activist in undergrad. I learned a lot of that work and a lot of the language in that space of doing that. Although I'm a huge fan, obviously I'm a gender studies professor now, and I love seeing that, and it's still a major minor where we don't get as many Black women, women of color, for a whole host of reasons that I definitely understand. I think I avoided women's studies because I was like, that's white women shit. Yeah. I think that's what I said in undergrad, if I'm perfectly honest. But learning that not only did that feminism not belong to white women, but there were so many of my foremothers who outlined this, indigenous feminisms, Black feminisms that date back centuries in terms of gender progressive work. So that was important to me. And doing that work now, I now teach the intro to women's and gender studies and have consistently for several years. And I love being the first, your introduction to feminism is a Black feminist. I think that's really important for students to see. And that a senior class gets to, when they're doing a senior seminar, is learning and your capstone is also a Black feminist. I'm teaching a contemporary Black feminist thought class in the spring at OSU. And I'm super excited. It's my first time getting to teach it. And to talk about how I got here, right? And it's a non-traditional way of thinking about that. The first time I proclaimed my feminism proudly for my senior project for AFM Studies, I directed and starred in a production of For Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And it's a choreo poem. So there was choreography, it was directing. But I was like, wow, I vibe with this. I think I might be a feminist. And I also read Joan Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, My Life as a Hip Hop Feminist. And I was like, oh shit, I can terrible rap music and still be a feminist? Oh, I'm in. And now it's the combination of me loving trap music and being very politically engaged, and I don't see them as contradictory but complementary, but finding a feminism, a women's studies, a gender studies lens that could accommodate the complexity of who I am and who I want to be, who I imagine myself to be. So I think it's a space that I hope more folks strive to inhabit or at least learn about. And my classes are welcome and open for folks to come, so holler at me. I'm Diva Feminist on Twitter, so you can follow me there. Yeah.
Give Treva a round of
Thank you all.